Hello, and welcome to this model making tutorial. My name is Andrew Shepherdson, and today we'll be going over how to build the RiceMaiden Models version of the Star Citizen Aegis Sabre Raven. Let's jump right into it. Now before I begin, it's important to point out in this model that the pieces that you see in white are going to be representative of the laser cut wood parts, and the pieces that you see in cyan are actually the 3D printed parts, so it shouldn't be that hard to tell them apart in this model. As difficult as, as complex as this model looks, it's actually relatively easy to put together. We got a couple steps we need to work through, but hopefully in the end the model should go together pretty easily and in enough chunks that you could either break it up over a couple build sessions or put it together at one time. As you can see, the model is relatively flat, and the things that we need to concern ourselves with are a couple of these angle pieces here on the front, as well as these main wing bodies. As you can see, they aren't quite in line with the vertical ribs in the center of the the center of the ship. So to begin with, we are going to put together the center ribbing of this ship, and that's represented by these guys right here. You'll have three pieces in your kit that will make up these long center ribs. Now, the two outer pieces are the same, and the one inner piece is different. And you can tell which one it is because it has these two locking tabs on the rear section of the rib itself. Now, as a nicety, if you want, these pieces also contain these two alignment pieces. If you want, while you're building it, you can use the alignment pieces to help give you a more solid foundation for putting those three pieces together. Once you get those three glued together, set them off to the side and let them dry before continuing to use this piece. This should give you time to move on to the next section. The next part we're going to put together is the wing cores. Now the wing cores are the angled pieces inside of the wings that make up the bulk of the wing assembly itself. So as you can see, I can turn on the rest of the ship, and it's a pretty significant piece of wood when you're done with it. So to begin with, we're going to start with the bottom. And again, when we go through these assemblies also have the option of using two more of these alignment cores here. You're welcome to use them, and they should be, let's see, oops, didn't want to turn that on. One of them is slightly longer than the other, so if I turn all this off, as you can see, the one in the rear is slightly longer than the one in the front. So when you're putting this together and you identify these pieces, again, they're rectangular in shape. They should be very easy to point out. Just make sure the rear one is longer than the front. And again, you can use them for alignment if you feel like it. You don't have to if you feel like you can get everything lined up by eye. So to put the wing cores together, we're going to start on the bottom, and the bottom piece is going to be this guy right here. And as you can see, its notable feature is that it has a really big hole in the center, and it's got this like super angled cut on the back. And another thing to note when we build this guy is that for these bottom pieces, and then going up to the top, this leading edge right here is actually going to slope towards the middle of the stack up and then slope back away as we go to the top. So once you've got this piece here, we're going to glue onto it the next piece, which is this guy right here. And again, that edge up here actually grows as we get up to the third layer, so keep that in mind. Now the way to pick this piece out is it's got this little kind of not quite, a little higher than 90-degree notch here on the back. So once we got that, we're going to go up to the biggest piece in the in the stack up, and it's going to be very easy to pick out because it's got this giant kind of extra winglet thing coming off the top. So once we get up there, we should have this nice, and I can go over to the other side. And again, these two sides are mirrors of each other. So if you build one, make sure you're building the other one as a mirror. Now that we're up to this, the almost the middle portion of this assembly, it's important to note what's going on this edge. As you can see on this edge, it's actually, none of these pieces line up with each other. You know, they're all slightly offset. And that idea is that when we put this against the center rib here, it's actually going to give us that angle that we're looking for. Those wings are not perpendicular to the center body. So make sure that when you put this guy together that you are maintaining that angle. And the easiest way to do that, especially if you're not using the locking ribs here, or excuse me, the alignment ribs here, is to just align the locking rib holes, or excuse me, the alignment rib holes. They should be straight through and pretty easy to align by eye if you're an experienced model builder. So once we get up here, we've got 3 layers. We got this guy, and this guy. Once we get there, we're going to start coming back in on the top. The next piece is this guy right here, and to pick it out, the 4th layer, it's going to have this alignment lug here on the bottom. It's the only piece that has that. So once we're done with that, we're going to go up to this guy. Now we can pick this guy out because it's got this really thin portion along the cutout. You know, as that cutout starts to get wider, it's going to start taking up more room, and so there's going to be less material up here for it. And it's also got this really hard cut up here at the top too. And finally, as you can, well, not finally, I got a couple more pieces, but if we get rid of that, the next piece is this kind of weird multi-pointy thing. And as you can notice at this point, we're actually going to lose that forward alignment lug due to this cutout. So you only have the rear alignment lug for aligning purposes. And then finally, when we get to the top, so after you've got it all together in this way, you got one more piece, and it's this guy. And what we're going to do with this guy is it does not have any aligning features. However, we can install it because it's going to align with this opening in the material down below. And it's also going to align with this front edge. As you can see, all of those top 4 layers align with the front edge here, and all of the top 3 layers align on this edge as well. So as you can see, we're going to align this guy up with this opening, and it should fit in there quite nicely and kind of give us this extra step in the cutout of the wing. Once we get these guys together, set them off to the side, let them dry so you can handle them readily, and then we're going to attach them to the center rib. So as I pointed out earlier, the center rib itself, well, the center rib has these 2 cutouts on each side, and these are for aligning the wings to the locking lugs on those wing cores we just made. So as you can see, there's the locking lug, and it's going to go into that cutout in the rib. So slather that guy with glue along this interface. Make sure that it's at the angle that the wing is prescribing for it, or the wing core is prescribing, and let this guy dry because you want this assembly to be stout before you can kind of build the rest of the ship. You can kind of do it slowly if you're experienced, but I would recommend letting this assembly dry before you continue. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start building this forward section. And I can turn that guy on and off for you and show you exactly what we're going to build. Whoops, not what I wanted. So to build this guy, let me start turning some stuff off really quick and see if I can't give you the kind of the basic rundown. So at this point on this side, The things that we're going to be adding are these forward ribs right here. It's got one more piece. So these 3 forward ribs we're going to add, and they should be pretty easy to add because they're perpendicular to the rib, so there's no funny angles. And they also, as you can see kind of in the preview, they have these locking lugs that go into the rib, so one on each piece. Apparently except for this guy. Why is there no locking lug on that guy? Well, as you can see, there's a locking lug on this piece, and I don't know why it's not showing up in the model on this piece, but if you give me 1 second, well, you know what, I'll just fix that later. Anyways, there is a locking lug on both of those pieces, and so this is the one that you want to look at. So as you can see, those 3 locking lugs line up with the 3 locking lug holes on those outside ribs, and these are on both sides. So when we put this together, you should be able to have you should be able to nestle this rear piece in against the wing core that you just installed, and it should basically go between the fuselage and come up to this little outrigger thing right here. Put some glue on it, put some glue against the fuselage, maybe put some glue on the back. It's going to create a nice solid platform in here that's going to brace everything, as well as this platform going forward. The next thing we're going to put into this guy is the intake. No, not that intake. Where is it? There it is. So actually, you know, we're not going to put that intake in there. I take that back. Not what we want to do just yet. What we want to do is we want to build out some of this fuselage before we put the intake on. So as you can see here, and actually I'm going to turn it on both sides so that we can get a better view. As you can see, what we're going to do is we're going to install this 3D printed piece. And this cockpit support piece is pretty easy to pick out. It's relatively chunky. And the notable feature is that on the front end of it, it's kind of got this little bitty curve. And that curve is going to line up with the transition between this piece here and this intermediate piece right here. So once you have that guy together, you should be able to, let's see if I can, nope. Okay, you know, we're just going to turn that all back on and just turn that off. So when you get this guy installed, you should be able to just push it up against the fuselage. It should sit on those 2 pieces back here, and it should butt up against the wing core that we just installed. Now to continue this assembly, you're going to put on this outer skin piece here. It's pretty long, should be pretty easy to point out, and it also pick out, and it also has that little tiny curve down here to follow the alignment with this intermediate front fuselage piece. Once we have this installed, then we can move to popping the intake on. Now the intake should sit in against that piece we just installed, sit against that bottom piece, and nestle itself right into this little cradle created by the wing core that we had previously installed. Once we get that guy on, we can flip it over and install the lower intake. Now the lower intake just sits inside this hole right here that you can see, and just basically glues up against the upper intake that we had previously installed. Once we get that guy installed, we can install the rest of the forward assembly. To do so, we're going to be installing these pieces right here. The first one we're going to want to install is this guy right here, and as you can see, there's nothing in here, so we just want to play around with these pieces, use some tacky glue on it, and make sure we can move them around so that we can get them in the right spot. So the first piece again would be to install this guy, and as you can see, curves in a little bit and doesn't quite hit the outside edge, here, you know, can sit against that spacer piece that we created earlier. Continuing on forward, we're going to put in the cockpit glass itself. So this guy sits at an angle. Well, it's going to be cradled on that piece we just installed and against the side of the center ribs here. In front of it is this little tiny piece, and it just sits in line, glued in place. Shouldn't be that big of a deal. And then moving back, we're going to have these two upper fuselage pieces that we're going to glue in place while we're here. The first of which is this front piece, and it's going to be, I mean, it's pretty easy to pick out because it's going to have this little notch here at the top. And then we got this piece right here, and as you can see, it's kind of this weird trapezoid that's got a square section on the top. And that's going to sit on top of this 3D printed spacer piece that we installed a little bit ago. So once you get that done, you have the upper forward control assembly all done. The final piece of that actually would be to install the guns. However, you're welcome to leave that to the very end because they're a little fragile, and you don't want to actually, you know, I'd recommend installing them at the very end. So I'll come back and address that at the end when we get to it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the rear assembly. So when we go back here to the rear, we have this nice little shelf thing here that we're going to pop the engine on. So as you can see, the rear assembly goes right here. To begin with, we're going to get this nice flat piece out that shouldn't be that hard to find. And it's going to sit right on top of this shelf. So just glue it down, should center itself between the two wings. Easy peasy. On top of that, we're going to slam the engine. Now the engine sits on here, butted up against the ribs and the wing cores, and then it's also going to have this leading or this trailing edge here that's going to fit within the profile of the laser cut wood, giving a very easy alignment. On the sides of it, to finish off this assembly, we are going to put in these spacers. The lowest level is going to be this shape right here, and it's going to have a little tang on the front and a little triangle notch thing on the back. And then on top of that, we're going to have one more spacer, and it's going to be significantly bigger and still have the little tang here at the back while not having that notch cut out of it. And this sits again against the wing core and the engine we just installed. So once we got that guy installed, we're going to move on to the top assembly. Now, let's see. Actually, you know what? We're going to do the wing. So we're going to do the wing tops first. And the wing tops are this top piece and the winglet. Now the winglet, I'm gonna vote and say that you do the winglets last. So I'm gonna turn those off again, just because it's kind of, the guns and the winglets are two things that take a full cure before you can really start handling it again. And so they're items that if you leave it till the very end, a lot of this model you can work through while stuff is drying. So if you do the center ribs, you can do the wing cores while the center ribs are drying and then glue it all together when you're done, and you should be able to work your way through it depending upon how fast your glue dries. However, when it comes to the winglets and guns, they are fragile in their installation, and so you'll really want to glue them, set the model aside, and let them fully dry before you're handling again. So on top of these wings, we're going to pop these big wing top pieces here. Now, as you can see, they align, so they're at an angle. So if the wing was at an angle, these top pieces are at a different angle than the wing, both front to back and side to side. And it should be relatively easy to figure out where they go. And let me see if I can point that out. So along this leading edge here, we have the wing is actually going to cradle some of what we had originally. So as you can see, there's kind of this ledge here that the wing top piece is going to butt up against. And the other thing we can help align ourselves with is that, as you can see, as it slopes down, this opening is going to cradle some of the features in our previous cutout. As you can see, it's going to cradle the rear edge this edge along this lower piece, as well as these two edges along these two lower pieces as well in the wing core. As you can see, there's an edge there and an edge there, as well as the edge that's, spin this, right here. So again, pop that guy on there. Make sure it's glued down on the back as well. As you can see, it kind of follows this cascading layer set down. There's a number of places you can glue it. Just kind of give it your best eye before you put it together and glue where you see fit. So once you got that done on both sides, now you should be in relatively good shape to continue with the rest of the top. So the rest of the top is this section right here. And how we're going to do this is we're going to first build up this area in here. And let me see if I can do this in a way that makes sense. So if I get some of this stuff turned off, we're going to see that there is a hole right here. So I will leave one side turned on and turn off the other side. So this is what you should be looking at when you start this top assembly. And the first piece to go in is this guy right here. It's just going to be this large flat piece that kind of fits the curvature of what's going on in here. But this piece is not going to set flat in it. This piece is going to set perpendicular to your center rib. So as that wing core is kind of diving off at an angle, this plate is going to sit in there as low as it can go, but it's going to sit perpendicular to the wing rib. So as you can see, it'll probably butt up against this wall and then just sit along this rib or sit along this piece right here, keeping it propped up. Once we have that piece installed, probably going to regret doing this, but we'll deal with it. Just get all this turned off so it's not confusing. The next two pieces we're going to install are these guys. So I got one extra piece. Well, I'll just leave that on. So on top of that big flat square piece we just installed, we're going to install these two other pieces. Now this guy is rectangular with a little tiny shave on it, and then this is going to have this nice curved cut to it. And this is going to start building up some of that geometry that the Sabre Raven has in this area. Once we get these two pieces installed, and again, they should fit relatively well on top of the piece. I mean, you can see they fit inside the profile of the piece we just installed. Once we get to that point, we're going to install this next piece, and it's this piece, but a little bit longer. As you can see, that piece we did just then is sitting underneath of it, and then on top of it is going to be this slightly longer version. And that's going to be on both sides. So as you can see, if I turn this stuff off, so there's this piece. Let me turn all this back off again. So as you can see, this is that first piece we installed, the two intermediate pieces there and then right there, and then that new piece we just installed on both sides. Once we get that piece installed, we can start working forward from that. So sitting in the hole that's kind of created forward of it, we're going to install this piece. And as you can see, it's got a little notch up here signifying the forward facing direction, as well as kind of this nice curve that'll fit in what's existing. And on the outside of that, as you just saw me turn off, so let me get kind of some of this away so we can see where we're at. So we're actually going to be installing these two pieces. And as you can see, actually let me turn off more of this assembly because that should not be installed. So we're going to be installing these two pieces, and again, this tail should fit into the notch between the two pieces of wood we had installed earlier. Should come forward and basically just be touching the front edge of the 3D printed cockpit support piece we had installed earlier, and then on the outside edge of it should be this other, I mean, it's a very unique piece cradling it. So once we get to that point, we can build up the stuff that's around it in front of that. So again, these are the two pieces we just installed. In front of it, we're going to have this piece right here, and there's kind of two angle cuts that fit in, as well as these two other pieces. And as you can see, all of these pieces here kind of sit on top of the 3D printed intake we installed earlier. So they should be relatively easy kind of glue and let dry kind of assembly. Once we're done with that, let me get these guys off. Once we're done with that, you can let that stuff dry and install the rearward section of the top. Let me see if I can find that. Here we go. So there should be a long kind of with a cutout that fits that profile of the engine. That should glue relatively easily in place up here. As you can see, it's got a nice ledge to glue against as well as in the front. And that'll finish out the top rear of the assembly. And then moving forward, the next two pieces we're going to install on both sides are these two just upper skin pieces. Now you got this guy right here, which has a bit of a curve to it and a notch on the front, and it's going to sit in a nice little notch provided to us by the 3D printed cockpit support. And then on top of that, we're going to have this nice thin piece, and it's going to be signified by the forward having this kind of curve away and the rear having this curve towards the back as well. And those two pieces are going to butt up against those center ribs and then against the side piece we just installed. At that point, you should have most of this front assembly done. If I turn these guys off, this should be kind of where you're at right now. You have that rear installed, you have this center section kind of built up, and then you have this forward section also glued in place. The next piece we're going to do is we're going to install these center upper pieces. Now the two first pieces that go on this layer have these locking lugs from the center ribs on them, so they should be relatively easy to install. So let me see if I can find them. Here we go. So this rear piece is going to have that nice big cutout, and it's going to have the little dong on the back that fits in right here to give us that nice flush assembly. And then in front of that, we're going to have this piece as well, and it's going to have a cutout for that locking lug as well. Make sure that when you're kind of putting this assembly together, I would recommend doing a test fit between this guy and this guy. If for whatever reason you don't have enough room, you can trim a little bit of this guy off to give you room, because this needs to sit flat in here. On top of this guy, we got these two pieces, and as you can see, it's just a smaller kind of profile of that lower piece, and same with the front. They kind of meet at the intersection and give you that nice kind of raised fuselage geometry. And then finally on top, we got this little fascia piece that adds more to the model. Once you're at this point, you're getting really close to being done. The last assembly that we have to put together is the bottom. Now the bottom shouldn't be all that difficult, but let's see if we can work our way through this. So the way I would recommend in doing this assembly is doing it rear to front. So if I can turn, so there's two kind of levels to this guy. The first of which is this kind of intermediate, this first level. Actually, let me see if I can turn this on. So as you can see, when we build this guy up, there's this first level that goes all the way across, and it kind of cradles your lower intake. And then you have this additional smaller intake which goes all the way back and actually sits on top of this intermediate assembly. So let me see if I can get us to a point where this will make sense. So the first thing you're going to want to do is, if you're at this point, we're going to want to install this piece, and it should be relatively easy to install because it sits on that tail piece and cradles these two extents coming from the wing core we installed earlier. Once you get that piece installed, we're going to install the next piece, which is these two guys right here. actually, I take that back. We're going to install these two 3D printed pieces next. So the 3D printed pieces are these kind of really thin support guys. They have a flat bottom and it sits flat against that wing core. And then on the rear edge, the cutout here follows the profile of the rib, of the wing core ribs that are right below it. So once we get those guys glued into place, then we can go on to the piece that's on top of this, which, yeah, that's going to be hard to find, so we'll just do this. So we're going to find these two pieces right here. They should be generally big, and they should be big and bigger and follow the general curvature of that flat piece that we just had. So I just hid the other one. There it is. So, and they should fit in the slot that we have going on here from the wing rib and that rear piece we just created. Moving on forward, we're gonna have the next piece in line, which is going to be these three pieces right here. So again, we're going to be looking at this on our model, and I can get rid of this too because that's probably annoying. Okay, so we're going to be looking at this on our model, and so what we're going to do is we're going to pop this guy on top, and as you can see, it's kind of a nice big broad piece, and it's going to cradle this rear support and this piece of that lower intake we installed earlier. Off of that, off the side, like on this flat right here, we're going to install this piece here. And as you can see, it's kind of got a notch going with it, as well as this notch in the rear. And we're going to basically cradle it between this flat piece and this back wall right here on the wing core. And then finally, we're going to have this. These two won't be installed. We're gonna bridge those two pieces we just did with this triangle piece, and you can pick it out because it's kind of got this little bit of a wavy pattern in it to fit this piece right here. So once you're done with that, you should be kind of looking at this right now. And as you've been seeing me get rid of, there's these final two pieces right here that you can install. Both of them are triangular. Both of them should fit in relatively easily, and as you can see, they bridge the gap that's created by, you know, the two pieces that these three pieces we had installed earlier. So once you're at that point, you should be looking at something close to this on the bottom of your ship. Well, with these pieces installed on both sides. Next, we're going to move on to the lower front section. To do this, and to begin with, we're going to build up the rib section on the outside very briefly. So if these are the three original center ribs, and again, I can flip this back over because we've been upside down for a little bit. On this bottom, we're going to be installing these two guys on both sides. And the way you can pick those parts out is they have these notches here on the rear of the ribbing that correspond with this flat piece here. The first guy, oops, didn't want to get rid of that. You know what? We're just gonna start from scratch on that guy again. So the lower piece is this guy right here. And it's going to be bigger, and it's going to have kind of a curve on its top that aligns with the supports we installed earlier. And then on the outside, we're going to have this smaller version of that guy, same cutout, but it's going to have a heavy kind of cut in it. And again, those go on both sides. Once you have those two built up on each side, we're going to start doing the outer skin on the bottom. I would start this bottom assembly with this piece right here. So you should have this long skinny piece. and it's going to stick into that gap that we have going here between the pieces we installed just a few minutes ago and the front kind of intake support section. Now this piece is at an angle, and it comes in and almost touches this guy, but the way, and to be fair, this piece is kind of a freehand installation, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Just keep in mind that it is both angled, it's tilted, against this piece, and it's also tilted it's also at an angle front to back. One thing to point out is that this front section comes up to this gap, so that should give you an idea of how deep it goes, as well as the notch that you see here should be in line with the leading edge of this piece we installed a little bit ago. So if I turn that back on, as you can see, that notch lines up with there, the leading edge lines up with that gap, and this guy comes in and almost touches this rib. You can play around with it to see what fits best. Now as you can see, the piece that goes into this gap is this triangle piece right here. It's got one little change in angle, and it's got it relatively flat back, and you can install that piece at the same time. As you can see, it's not quite flat, and it's just used to bridge that gap. As you can see, it kind of is still at an angle to that lower piece that we installed a little bit ago. Moving to the front, you're going to have this guy here and this guy here. And as you can see, they have a little bit of an angled cut front to back, as well as this sloping section. And those guys just basically bridge the remaining gap that you got going on here to kind of make a nice rounded front bottom section. So as you can see, this butts up against that long piece we just installed and basically touches the fuselage here. You can glue there, you can glue there. And the other nice feature is that it also kind of follows the curvature of these ribs that we put in, so it shouldn't give you a ton of headache. And then finally, we got this front section. It's got an angled cut, round front surface. Should be able to install it just fine. Moving on to I guess at this point, all we have left to install is this final. Get rid of those as well because we still got those to do. The only thing left we have to do on the bottom is the intake. And to do this, we should start at the back. So on the back of this guy, we're going to install this little wood piece here. And as you can see, it's just basically at the edge at the intersection of these two guys. Shouldn't be all that critical on kind of where it goes. Next, we're going to install this piece here. And it's going to basically come from the width of that piece up to here. And you can kind of tell how high it goes because as you can see kind of in the model, where the ribbing changes from an angle, from that angled slope to a flat, is about how high this piece goes. And we're going to center it on those ribs so that it's centered on the model. Next piece is this square guy, and you can tell, as you can see, it's a little bit of a trapezoid. You can tell which orientation it goes because one of the sides is going to line up perfectly width-wise with the edge of this piece we just installed. In front of that, we're going to have a larger trapezoidal piece. Again, edges line up, width to width. And then finally in front of that, we're going to have this forward intake piece. And as you can see, it's got a little bit of a curved hook on each side, and it's going to hang over the ribs just a little bit, but not a ton. Just wherever it lands in kind of the stack up of these pieces is fine. Finally, on the outside edges, you're going to have these spacer pieces, and they're going to be installed in an angle, so you'll be left with this nice chunky gap here, and we're going to fill those in with these guys. So as you can see from this lineup, in the rear, and I would probably start with the rear, you got this nice long skinny triangle piece that's going to kind of fill in that gap at an angle. And as you can see, there's just a little bit of a shallow angle. It's really not a whole lot. And it goes to the intersection of these two pieces, so front to back shouldn't be that hard. The intermediate, you have this interesting looking piece with a notch. that notch lines up with the notch in these two lower pieces right here. Make sure you get its orientation correct. And then finally you have this nice long skinny piece that's going to have this little cutout in the front. And that's going to, end the stack up front to back from your lower intake side, or your lower intake sides. So once we're done, we should be left with this on the bottom of our Raven. At this point, you are mostly done with the model. The two things left that we kind of put off until the very end were the guns and the winglets. The guns should be relatively easy to install. They are not symmetric. As you can see, the gun base should have this notch in it. You can see it right here. And what that is that notch is meant to align with kind of the natural flow of the wood, as you can see right here. So you're going to have this intake support piece, and then you're going to have this cover, and where they intersect is basically where you're going to want to glue that guy into place. Now front to back, you can see that there's a bit of a gap behind the gun. I'd basically say that just kind of eyeball it. You can see that where the leading edge of this kind of forward section starts to dive away. You just put it one muzzle. I'm drawing a blank on what to call it. This barrel attachment thing. It's one length from where that starts to curve away. And you can do that on both sides. I recommend gluing this and setting it upright to dry, just like this. Unless you use super glue, in which case it'll probably dry really quickly. And then at that point, we're gonna do the final piece, which is the winglets. Now the winglets, depending upon kind of what you have, shouldn't be all that hard to install. As you can see, the winglets go at just a little bit over a 45-degree angle from, up and down on this guy. So when you glue these, I'd recommend using some form of like a tacky glue, and then propping these things up with, something you have around the house. At this point, this model sits relatively easily on its belly, so you should be able to just kind of prop those winglets up against something when it's drying to hold their shape. One thing about gluing kind of free assemblies like this is make sure you have glue on both sides of the joint. If you don't, like if you just have glue on this side of the joint, as it dries, it shrinks and it's going to pull this winglet in and it's going to ruin your angle. So make sure you have glue on both sides so that when it dries relatively in the same angle that you had it in. And that's it. That is the end of building your Sabre Raven. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Feel free to leave me any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Thanks. Bye.